Hello friends, and welcome back to the second in the series of how to make your Helix amp models sound even better than the amplifiers that they were modeled on. In our first episode, we looked at things that I think were pretty obvious. Getting rid of the extraneous hum and noise in the models by turning down the hum and the ripple in the amp settings. This time, we're going to start getting into areas that are a little bit more subjective, but are based on the fact that the designers of the Helix give you the flexibility to become your own amp designers. You can create amps that work for your sound, your style, feel the way you want them to when you play them, by creating amps that don't even exist in the real world. Now let me start by saying that every amp that has ever been produced, no matter how great you think it is based on compromises. It may be compromises based on the selling price of the amplifier. It could be about the limitations of technology at the time. And I know some of you are thinking, well, it was the limitations of technology that made these amplifiers so special. Well, perhaps. Give me a call on your rotary dial phone and I'll be happy to debate that with you. I believe that we can make all of these amps work for us better and sound better than the originals. And what we're going to look at today is bias. So what is tube bias? It's a complex subject, so I'm going to simplify a lot. But we can say that bias is a baseline voltage applied to your power amp tubes when no input signal is present. Kind of like your car idling at a stoplight. Now there are two major kinds of bias, cathode biased and fixed bias, and both have their own characteristics. Some amps that are cathode biased are the Vox AC30, the Matchless DC30, and the Bad Cat Black Cat. Some people refer to these amps as Class A amps, but that's not technically accurate, so we're going to stick with calling them cathode biased. Cathode biased amps are fed a voltage that is around 50% of their maximum capacity. That means you only have the remaining 50% to work with, so they have less dynamic headroom. Why would manufacturers do this? Because they're like a dragster revving the engine up, waiting to take off. When you play a note, they respond nearly instantly with a bright, defined attack. The lack of headroom means they also have strong tube compression, and they quickly saturate with a very pleasing distortion. The majority of all amps that are more than 30 watts are fixed biased amps, like nearly all Marshalls, Mesa Boogies, the PV5150, and they are fed a negative bias voltage, so they completely turn off when no signal is present. They're like a car at a stoplight with the engine shut off. They take longer to start up and respond when you play a note, so they have a slower, softer attack, but they have 100% of the tube's capacity available for amplification. Fixed bias means more headroom, less compression, and a more aggressive distortion when the tubes saturate. The Helix gives you a lot of flexibility to change the bias of each amp model to sound like either a fixed bias or a cathode biased amp. Things that couldn't be done in the real world. Pretty cool. So I've picked a couple of amp models inside the Helix that demonstrate these two different characteristics. One of them is the Helix model of the Vox AC30, which they call SX30, and the other one is a model of the PV5150, which they call the PV Panama. We're going to play around with the bias settings in both of these amps inside the Helix and see what kind of new tones we can come up with. I think you'll be surprised. Let's jump in. Okay, so the first model I've opened up here is the Essex A30, which is Line 6's model of the Vox AC30. And this is a very good depiction of what a cathode biased amp sounds like. Very compressed sound, very defined attack, very jangly like you would expect out of this amp, and not a lot of headroom. It is very squished. You can tell that as I was picking softer, everything would clean up. Picking just a little bit harder drove it into saturation. And that is with our bias. Everything on here set just when I opened the model up, except I did go ahead and turn down our hum and ripple, which we did in the last video. Okay, so bias here at the center point. Let's take it to the extremes and see what we get. If we heat up the bias all the way to this end, now the first thing that I would expect is that we're going to lose even a lot more headroom. This should be even more compressed. Oh yeah, it's hard to get any volume difference out of it. And now the attack is even a little bit more pronounced. The rest of the signal's down in volume. Let's take it all the way to the other extreme and cold bias this. Now that is a very, very interesting sound because it has the qualities of a Vox AC30, but everything is opened up. The attack is softer, but you can just hear that even though that really nice distortion is coming through in the saturation, you've got a lot more headroom there. A lot more dynamics. That's a really cool spot for this. And of course, anywhere in the middle. A lot of times, I find with a lot of the models in here, biasing them just a tad bit hotter. Like this, I'm going to go from 5 just up to 5.5. You lose a little bit of the saturation when you bias just a little bit hotter. It's probably a little more compressed, but everything just seems to tighten up a little bit. This is one of the compromises you see. Tubes that are biased too hot in an amplifier are going to burn out sooner. So a lot of times, what you're delivered is not necessarily the sweet spot for the sound, but it's the sweet spot for the tube life combined with the sound. One more compromise they have to make. You'll find that this control, the bias control, is very interactive, and it works differently in each amp depending upon the circuitry that's used in it. But you still can find just a wealth of new and usable sounds by sweeping from one end of the bias to the other. We're going to switch over to the PV Panama, which is their take on the PV 5150 amp. Of course, we're going to see a lot of different characteristics out of this. And one of the things that I want to compare, I'm going to play something a little bit different just so that we can hear the attack and compression characteristics of these different biases. Let's take this up and bias it extremely hot. Wow, okay, that is pretty cool already. It's a compressed sound with a little bit less saturation in it, but that attack, it's almost to where we were on the AC30. A very fast attack, very well defined. Nice. Let's go down to the other extreme and see what we've got here. Very cold bias now on this. Now, interesting. A lot of the tonal characteristics are the same, but I can feel it when I'm playing. The attack is not as well defined. It's kind of soft the way the attack comes into it. Go up to the top again. And of course, again, in here, default position on the bias was 6.3 on the PV Panama. Let's play around just in the vicinity of it and see what we get. Ooh, lots of nice sounds to be had in there. So you can just completely change the characteristics and the feel of the amplifier by just adjusting the bias in here. And you may have noticed on the screen here that right underneath bias we have another control called bias X. That stands for bias excursion, and that is related to sag, which we're going to cover in the next video. But this should give you a good starting point for experimenting with your amp biases in Helix. You'll find a lot of very cool sounds in there. Okay, well, hopefully this will help you be on your way to creating some unique sounds in the Helix that are all your own. And if you're ready to join the Helix family, give the guys at More Guitars a call. They would love to help get you into the 21st century of amplification. Next time, we're going to take a look at sag and bias excursion. See you then.